Today we're going to be getting into the second part of our series on active and passive food production, focusing again on organic gardening. Today we're going to focus in fact on a simple step, just the preparation of seed trays. It's the second week of April here at Trois Corbeil's Hollow in the Highlands of Nova Scotia, and for us that means it's about 6 weeks, maybe 7, until we plant our gardens. We wait until the chance of frost is about 80% behind us, and for us that falls about the 1st of June. Now, there is a chance that a frost could happen in the first or second weekend after June, but by waiting till the 1st of June to plant, we will bypass much of that risk of frost. But to be ready to plant on June 1st, we do have to prepare a couple of things. We like leeks, and leeks are very hardy, but they are long, slow growers, and they need a fair bit of time in the gardens to grow. Fortunately, once they reach maturity, they are extremely cold hardy, but to have them grow successfully, we do have to start them early. So we're going to start our leeks now, about 6 weeks before planting time. It also helps to plant the leeks early because for the first few weeks of their growth, they just look like grass, and they're very hard to distinguish from actual weeds that we may need to remove from the garden. So we'll seed the trays now and let them grow there over the next 6 weeks or so until they're 7 or 8 inches tall and ready to transplant out into the garden. They will have strong root systems at the time, but also importantly, it will be easy to distinguish the leeks from weeds that we have to remove. I'm also going to start parsnips now. Now, parsnips don't strictly have to be started early in my experience. They're very cold hardy once they get a little maturity behind them, but they are also very hard to tell from surrounding weeds if you seed them directly into the garden. So we start them in trays too, so they can have some growth behind them before we transplant them out into the gardens. And that way, it's much easier to remove weeds and avoid accidentally pulling up a parsnip that we want to keep in there. By the way, we eat a lot of those weeds, and we'll cover that later on when we look at passive gardening. So I have some basic soil starter here, and I'm going to use this as opposed to compost because this soil is sterile. If I were to use soil directly from the compost, it would have seeds in it that could potentially germinate over the next 2 or 3 years, and I really don't want to be digging out those seeds while I'm trying to focus on growing just these seedlings. So what we're going to do is put enough of this dirt in the tray to make it about 3 inches deep or so, or just short of the lip of the tray. Some of this dirt is actually frozen. It's been quite cold in the evenings, but that's okay. We can break this all up with a little bit of effort and have it ready to go very shortly. We want all the dirt to be broken up, nice and friable. If you find any small items in there, just go ahead and toss them out and just get in the way of what we want to be happening in our dirt, which is the growing of our seeds, our starter plants. At whatever latitude you live in, you might be trying to grow other things. Here, we would use starter trays like this to start leeks and parsnips, and that's about all. Now, we have a fairly short growing season here, even though we live in Nova Scotia. Because we're close to 1,000 feet of altitude and in a snow belt, our climate here is closer to that of Newfoundland. We have a fairly short growing season that we have to make the most out of. So, one of our growing strategies is to grow things that require very little maintenance given our seasonal conditions. Thus, we avoid things that are going to need to be started in a greenhouse. In fact, we avoid greenhouses. From my perspective, why waste the power and the time and the maintenance on them, when instead what I can do is focus on growing things that are hardy and appropriate to our growing zone. I like to grow an heirloom variety of leeks called large Musselburgh. I've been growing these in our gardens for many years with great success. Here's a picture of my daughter holding a couple of the leeks that we harvested from our gardens a few years ago. And these are pretty typical of the leeks that we get over here by following the methodology that I'm going to start teaching you today. For you, if you're growing other plants that have a long, slow growing time or a long, slow germination period, or both, you would also want to start your seeds in trays so that they can be ready to go for the growing season. So to seed leeks, what we're going to do is we're going to make little indents about 1 centimeter or so, kind of like this across the tray. I know some people, they'll use rulers and they'll use special tools to press down the soil and everything. I've been growing a lot of my food for pretty much all of my life, and I don't have time to do that, and I don't really see any purpose in doing that. This works just as well. The leeks don't especially care how particular you are, and it's not so important if you put them very close together because you're going to separate them later on. When we separate them, we're just going to cut the root systems with a knife up near the top, and then we're going to try to shake out as much of the root below. You'll see when we get around to it. But leeks are very hardy, and that's actually going to benefit them. Every time you damage a leek's root system, it wants to grow bigger. That's part of why leeks require 2 transplants to really become huge. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just keep it to planting leeks right now. So I've made several rows, about 1 centimeter deep, and we're going to lay in the leek seeds. They're very tiny. A bit bigger than a grain of sand, but not by much. And we're just going to drop 1 leek seed in roughly every centimeter. So now the tray is fully seeded, and we're just going to dust over the seeds by toppling over the lip of these little rows. The leek seeds are so tiny, and you want to just cover them over with a few millimeters of soil, 1, 2, 3 millimeters, certainly not as much as half a centimeter, because when the seedlings emerge from the seeds, they have to get to sunlight so they can make energy and continue growing. If you cover them up by much more than a bare minimum, just a dusting, they may run out of the energy that was contained within their seed to feed them while they're growing through the soil before they can reach sunlight and make their own energy. So you want to be careful in order to properly start those seeds that you just barely cover them. In truth, I have thought before about possibly getting something like a sugar shaker that a baker would use to dust donuts and such, and using that to shake some soil over the seeds in order to just barely cover them up. That would actually be perfect. It would be ideal. I love the feel of good dirt in my hands, always have. I grew up on a farm as a child, and my grandfather grew much of our own food, a tradition I was always drawn to and carried on. And as far back as I can remember, I've had soil under my feet and between my fingers. There's nothing else quite like the feeling of good, fertile, rich soil that you know is going to feed you and care for you in the coming year. Parsnip seeds look like rolled oats, tiny rolled oats. They're very small and papery. You also get a lot per package. But as far as depth and spacing, it's about the same as leeks. So that's about 1 to 1/2 centimeter. So you want to space them, when they're seeds like this, about 1 centimeter apart in these rows. Because they're a little bigger than leek seeds, they're a little easier to manage, and because they're flat, they don't tend to tumble together. It makes them a little bit more convenient to work with. And because I get far more in a package than I'm possibly going to use, if I get a couple of them that are stuck together or whatnot, I don't worry about it. I can separate the seedlings later, and if they both look strong and they both separate well, I'll plant them both. And if they don't, well, I'll just take the biggest and the strongest from the pair. Just like with the leeks, I'm going to seed more than I actually want to plant, so I have some redundancy when planting day comes along. Normally wouldn't waste time separating the parsnip seeds, but we had about 3 or 4 all come out right on top of each other right there, and that wouldn't help them in their growing. So just separate them a little bit. They seem to be determined to hang out together today, though. Our goal with the parsnips is just going to be to grow them till they're about 2 or 3 inches tall, and then they can be transplanted out in the garden. We just want to get them big enough that they have a head start on the weeds, and when it is time to do our occasional weeding, we can easily tell them from the weeds so that we don't accidentally pull up seedlings. Parsnips are delicious. They are incredibly slow growers. Fortunately, once they have some maturity behind them, you don't really have to worry about cold weather affecting them all that much. They are extremely cold hardy once they get past their seedling stage. And from that first pinch I took out, we have a lot of seeds left over. You get so many parsnip seeds in a little package. Just as with the leeks, we're going to cover them over carefully with just a dusting of the soil. We just want to cover them over with a few millimeters, and we don't want to pack it or anything. Once the parsnips germinate from those tiny little seeds, we want the seedlings to be able to climb up toward the light fairly easily so that they can start making energy for themselves and get bigger while they're in the trays. Now, all we have to do is water these trays and put them someplace where it's moderately warm and where they're going to get access to sunlight every day, and let them start the process of germination. I'm going to use this simple garden water with very small holes. It's still going to gush out a little bit more than I would want to. So to help control it, I've just put in a little bit of water at the bottom so that there's not a lot of weight or mass behind the water. And I'm going to start the pouring away from the tray so that I can get it kind of like a rain, because when these things first start pouring, they have a tendency to sort of slosh out. And there, that's all you want to do. Just make sure it's all evenly covered, and that way your seeds can begin. So now the plants that are long to germinate and long to grow are seeded, so they can have a few weeks head start on the growing season when they actually go out to the gardens. So that's it for today's lesson on organic gardening and active and passive food production. We'll continue soon.